Afternoon, everyone. I'm going to pick up where Fred started this morning and looking back as we look forward. And I'd like to address most of my comments to the students in the room because we were all once students ourselves. In 1980, Tom Hunt, who happens to be here, an ecologist from Wisconsin, and I arrived early at the University of Wisconsin-Madison before we began our graduate curriculum. And it happened to be one of those benchmarks. And that was the 1980 conference of CELA, Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture. And it was a path-breaking moment, even as there may have been only 100 of us there. We were able to slide in on the cheap, which was always helpful. And that conference led to the creation of something very important, Landscape Journal. And that conference was dominated by conversation to the point ad nauseum. Is landscape architecture an art or a science? In every article that was presented, every conversation that was taken over the great beer and food that was served came to that point at a time in the discipline, art forms development as a profession and as a calling. Even in Arizona, when we had the next, quote, watershed event in my life that led to ecological design and planning, a book that still has some legs. When we were considering the introduction that needed to be written for that particular book, we were still befuddled, still trying to get beyond that same argument. Is landscape architecture, is planning in general an art or a science? And we were even then having to advocate the necessity of the two being kindred spirits, that they were not competitive, that they are aligned fundamentally in the head, in the heart, in what goes on between our mind, our eyes, and our hands as we design in the drawing room or on the land itself. Today, last night, not one word about is landscape architecture, is planning an art or a science. And so for someone who is in the publishing world and sees a lot of changing language for old ideas, I think this is significant. It's pivotal because it shows how far we have come. And the language continues to evolve, and it's the nature by which we explain ourselves. And the language has become sophisticated even as we continue to find the need to define particular terms. Whether it's John Fraser Hart, the famous geographer of Minnesota, employing his students still at 88 teaching in Minneapolis, that when you use the word landscape in your project or in your article or in your book, you need to define it, just as we were wrestling this morning with concepts of nature and the baggage that we bring with us. But I also think the language has become even more hopeful, and I hope that continues. I should also like to mention that ultimately what everyone is doing here and has been doing is good. When you look to the past, whether it's Getty's, or McHarg, or Ian, or the architects that gave us our great national parks, we were all looking to do good. And what is hopeful in a conference such as this is that public good has become an important component of our discussion, not so much private gain. And I think we have that sensibility among us all in this room, that somehow, through our own lives, through our own commitments, through our own joys and frustrations, that we're ultimately trying to do good through the time that we're given here on this special earth. I also think it's critical that we pay more attention to getting the word out, and something that we have been talking about around the edges. And that is, in my world, which is the publishing world, it's vital that we continue to tell stories, but we need to get outside the academy increasingly more and more. I'm a publisher in residence in addition to a publisher to many universities, and I've had the pleasure of coming to Fritz's faculty to discuss the publishing project, and I have one-on-one consultations with faculty throughout the United States on their particular projects. And I would encourage every one of you to make sure that at least once a year, if not more, you are writing an op-ed piece into the local paper. You are writing a letter to the editor, to a professional journal, because you have something to say. May I give an example? I've been a publishing and writing expert for a National Science Foundation sponsored program at the University of Colorado that brings in first-year geography faculty and first-year chairs. And we're working on writing and publishing. We have someone from NSF on how to do grants. We have others on how to write syllabi, etc. And what becomes very clear in all of that is that you need to make the interconnections between one another. You need to be talking outside yourself. So here's an example. A new assistant professor from China who has had some difficulty with English as a second language was asking me, how can I improve my writing? And I kept hearing him talk and talk. And I just went, have you listened to yourself lately? And what his research had evolved is that working in the bluegrass country of Kentucky and the effects of climate change on vegetation, in particular primary species within that particular region, for some reason the white ash was blooming later, 3 to 4 weeks later than normal, whereas every other plant species was blooming 3 to 4 weeks early. And those of Laramie, Wyoming last year had blooming gardens in February. So I said, why are you keeping this information to yourself? People are going to the nursery and buying white ash for their own backyards. They would be interested to know what's going on. So the short of the story is, by some coercion, he was able to contact the science writer for the Lexington paper. There was a 3-page article about his research. He was interviewed, he was able to convey his information. All of a sudden, all of this information that was only embedded in a small research paper was suddenly now being circulated to 160,000 readers. Each of you have your own story to tell, and you're obligated to inform the public, because the public needs to know what you are doing and the great benefits. Look at the successes that we have seen here today. Look at the successes of thousands of years of work in peasant farming to change our landscape so that it becomes ours. So I encourage you to continue that path, to go to meetings, and to make that presence known. I'm also very impressed at how international we have become. The case studies shown here show a global perspective of hope and of vision and of overcoming the odds that we as human beings in our own nature have to overcome, because we're flawed creatures. We're selfish, but we're also generous. And so by connecting the dots to our own worlds and to those around us in sessions such as this, and through our own ability to get outside our comfort zones, to go into unfamiliar, discomfortable places, I think that's extremely important. It's also represented, for example, in the work that I started at Johns Hopkins in 1980s with a series called Creating the North American Landscape, which helped to change the way publishers think about the land. Today, I'm in the process of resurrecting that series, but with a new name called Creating the Human Landscape, because it is now a global series. It is not simply focused on North America. Again, it seems insignificant, but it's a huge departure from where we were in looking at the world in front of us. I'd also like to make mention that even as our world is becoming more urban, and will continue to be so, there are millions and millions and millions of people who are not in the city. And we can't forget them. I still run a nonprofit called the Center for the Study of Place with the help of Tom. Fritz was on our board at one point, and others. And we have a research library in the Sandhills of Nebraska. Sandhills of Nebraska is a 24,000 square mile region, which is half the size of Pennsylvania. 5,000 people live there. But they're wrestling with the same issues that are going on in the urban systems. The scales are different. One last recommendation and request. We're going to have a hard time introducing this book. As I said earlier, we were still wrestling with the idea of art versus science, art and science, even 20 years ago. But today, you can see the richness of the materials that we have to work with. And anyone who has any ideas on how we should frame that introduction, please see us after the session. Thank you very much.